I'm blessed. I'm blessed by the opportunity to do this. So thank you for giving it to me, and thank you to those of you who have been consistent in participation each time we do this. We're turning to the book of Ecclesiastes today, and this is a problem book. Job is difficult, but we have a general sense of understanding of Job. Ecclesiastes often stands outside our way of thinking. In fact, people have argued that Ecclesiastes is sub-Christian. The book expresses so much skepticism that we wonder, and in fact, in the first century, rabbis wondered whether it belonged in the scriptures or not. And so several rabbis met to discuss the problems of Ecclesiastes, and finally concluded that it should remain in the canon, but they were troubled by it, as many of us are from time to time. Once in a while, in Proverbs, you get strange ideas. For example, the idea that a bribe can get you a hearing by a government official. Well, that doesn't seem entirely consistent with Scripture, and so we puzzle about it. But we with the preponderance of the material that's in Proverbs, we realize that that's not a standard idea in Proverbs, but in Ecclesiastes, the skeptical nature of the book is so profound that it's hard for us not to think that something is going on that we are not comfortable with. So we'll start the PowerPoint here and get it going for us. Are you seeing the whole screen as the book of Ecclesiastes now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you. So we start with the book of Ecclesiastes, and as always, we start with the fundamental issues. Boy, why is this not? Oh, I got it. Let me stop this, and I don't know why it's acting the way it's acting. Okay, the screen that you're seeing is different from the screen that I need to control. So just at the very beginning, we start with the question of authorship. This question has been profoundly debated. Is this really Solomon? One of the most recent scholars who has waded into this issue has concluded that it's not Solomon at all. In fact, there are 3 or 4 otherwise solid evangelical scholars, and 1 or 2 who call themselves evangelical who are not, but who are saying that this book is engaging in a practice where by which one adopts a persona for literary purposes and makes statements in the guise of that persona, and you then read the book in light of that fictional persona. Another author who had pretenses to being an evangelical, but I don't think he is, said that actually the core of the book of Ecclesiastes is profoundly pessimistic and skeptical about truth, about God, about everything. But some later Jew looked at the book and considered there were some things there that ought to be saved for posterity. So he put the introduction of the book, where you get the evidence for Solomon's kingship, and the ending of the book, he put those in in order to rescue the book. And I thought, well, if it's that pessimistic and it's that negative, why would you want to rescue it in the first place? So that these problems persist, and they're not going to go away anytime quickly. So what are we to make of the authorship of this book? And my way of, let's look at the theories. First is the traditional view, Solomon. And the evidence for that are verses 1:1 and 16 and 2:9. Let's look at them. Not that you're not familiar with them, but verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then in verse 16, I said to myself, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And then finally 2:9, then I became great and increased more than all that preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. So this is the traditional view. Our question is going to be, can we defend it? 1 Kings 8:1, of course, Solomon gathered all Israel, and you see the word kahal there in the text. In Hebrew, kahal. This is the root to gather. This is the root for the name of the book in Hebrew, Kohelet, Qohhelet. And it's feminine because often titles for offices are feminine in Hebrew. So Kohelet, the gatherer, or the Ecclesiastes, the one who calls for the gathering or who proclaims in the gathering. Well, that's where we get from the Greek word Ecclesiastes, is where we get our name Ecclesiastes through Latin. Dillard and Longman comment that so much profound and godly wisdom originates with a man who eventually apostatized is too much for some. It's not too much for me. It's entirely possible to be wise in your middle years and foolish in your old years. It's entirely possible to embrace wisdom and then walk away from wisdom. These are things that are not difficult for me. And so, but this is one of the arguments against the traditional view that Solomon is the author of the book. Another possibility is that it's an unknown wise man, some assembler, Kohelet, writing about Solomon. My problem with this view is the claims that the author makes, if they are fictional, lack any semblance of reality. I am not a rich man, though by even American standards, we live very, very well. I'm not a rich man. So if I told you about the foolishness of great riches, if I told you about the foolishness of fame and power, I would mislead you, because frankly, I've never had great riches, fame, or power. And so there is no ground for me to say pleasure. I've given myself over to every pleasure, and I've found it empty, meaningless. I haven't given myself over to every pleasure. I don't deny myself what I consider legitimate pleasures, but I haven't given myself over to every pleasure. I haven't built buildings. I haven't planted gardens and watched them grow and become flourishing. So I can't tell you out of my experience that these things are fleeting in importance. I may assert that and appeal to conventional wisdom on it, but I can't say that out of my own experience. So if this is not Solomon, it seems to me the book loses all of its punch, all of its power, because I can fictionalize anything. I can tell any story that I want and have the outcome I want, but the outcome of my story doesn't have any weight morally because it's fiction. and I can't say that these things are true from my own experience. So it just seems to me that even though this is the traditional view, the evidence for the traditional view disappears very soon after chapter 2 and 3. On the other hand, the book makes more sense if it's someone who has actually gone through the things that he's gone through. One of the arguments against Solomon's authorship is that he can't seem to control the courts. The author of the book can't seem to control the courts. So there was wickedness where there ought to be justice. Well, if Solomon is an absolute king and is incredibly powerful, why can't he control the judges? And probably the answer is you can only ask that question if you've never had great power. It's always circumscribed. The American president is sometimes called the most powerful man in the world. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm just appealing to what is often stated about the American president. It scares me to death with our present president. But let's assume that the American president is, for the moment, we'll assume this, the most powerful man in the world. The problem is the minimum term of office for an American president is 4 years and the maximum is 8 years. And he must leave. And there are appointees who continue in office, who started in office before the present president came to his position, and will continue in office after he leaves his position. And they have power that the president may try to curtail, but he can't altogether. And that would be true for a king as well. And so at some point, you see how deeply embedded in our governmental system here in America, you see how deeply embedded ideas that are fundamentally anti-Christian are. And even if we had a very, very excellent president who was a Christian with Christian commitments, who was an excellent administrator, who was an excellent leader, if that were all true, he still would not be able to get rid of all these things. And you will say, well, yes, but that's a president. We're talking about a king, and that's true. We are talking about a king in Solomon, but he's facing the same kinds of problems. People whom his father appointed to office have a claim on Solomon that no other appointee to office would have in Solomon's day. So I don't personally have any problem holding the view that Solomon is the author of the book. The only problem with it is that you wonder if Solomon is also the author of Proverbs, how could he write Ecclesiastes? Part of the answer may be that Proverbs was something that he collected over his life, over the whole period of his life. Ecclesiastes is his ruminations on the ideas that were in Proverbs in light of a lifetime of experience and the frustration of trying to carry out wisdom when people that are in your administration are not committed to wisdom. So it may be something along that line that we can attribute the pessimism of the book of Ecclesiastes to. I don't think it's as pessimistic as people usually say, but I'm camping on the general view of Ecclesiastes for the moment. We'll try to correct that as we go. Some have even said that the name Kohelet is a proper name, as in Nehemiah 7:57, there is a man named Sopheret, which means scribe. And it's as in English, the family names, we have family names here, and some Indians have adopted family names, as the Spurgeon family has, but especially England and the United States and Germany, where most of our population have come from, the the last name is often either a reference to your national origin. The name Allman is an ancient name for Germany, so it may be my name may signify James the German. Smith is a reference to a person who worked with iron. He was an iron worker. Of course, shepherd, it's transparent. Baker, all of these are references to professions, to crafts, and so Kohelet and Sopheret may be such a thing. The date of the book, we can't really answer it until you've answered the question of authorship, and we can't really answer absolutely the question of authorship. I think there's a good case to be made for Solomon, but lots of people downplay the case. And so what are we to make of that? Guesses have been made. If Solomon is the author, Solomon's reign was from 970 to 930 BC. If he is the author, then the time of writing would probably be late in his reign. If it's an unknown Kohelet, then we don't have any idea what the date is. Some date the book of Ecclesiastes as late as the 2nd century BC, being influenced by Greek philosophy. I've read not much Greek philosophy. I've read enough about it to think, yeah, I can see why, if you were kind of a dabbler in these things, you might say that, but there's no Greek philosophy in the book of Ecclesiastes. There are other problems with the book. It apparently contradicts other scripture. It seems to suggest that most of life is meaningless, whereas virtually everything else in scripture is talking about the meaning of life in one way or another. So it apparently contradicts other scripture in terms of existential despair. However, if you read Ecclesiastes and come to despair, it's because you haven't been paying attention. You're seeing what you expect instead of seeing what's actually there. There is the problem of pessimism. The book is profoundly pessimistic about human life and human effort. But I've lived long enough to see that that's pretty much true. Human life and human effort. It just seems like I have been saying recently, I could help God out with the church. I would love to give him some advice, and if he would adopt my advice, it would solve all the problems in the church. And my advice is, God, quit saving sinners. Just save righteous people. And if you'll just save righteous people, all the troubles in the church will go away. But God saves sinners, and that's the problem in the church. We have sinful people, and that includes the elders and the pastors and the teachers. So the issue for us is, if I look merely at the human component of the church, I must be pessimistic about it. But if I point of view, I must revel in the human component of the church, realizing that God, in his mercy, saves sinners, and through the most unlikely of tools, he works his great work over the centuries. Rationalism and skepticism. The book of Ecclesiastes seems to look at the world from, and I'm going to use language here that I'll try to explain, from the surface of the earth out, rather than from heaven down. If I look at the world simply as it is, the task that's been given to the church is impossible, and we would do well simply to draw into our fortress, build the walls against all the world's attacks, and do the best we can with life until we die and go with the Lord in heaven, and everything will be better. But that's looking at the world wrong. Again, I'm going to make a kind of nonsense statement, but I'll explain it. Fish never rationalize about water. Well, you will say fish never rationalize about anything. You're right, but fish don't realize the significant water until they're taken out of it. You and I, if we live this world, live the life in this world only from a human perspective, we will not understand that the most questionable events of life can, in fact, work the plan of God. So, as an example, how can any suffering be worthwhile? How can any suffering be worthwhile? And frankly, when you're in the midst of suffering, and the more severe it is, the worse. The problem is when you're in the midst of suffering, you ask the question, why is the Lord allowing this to happen to me? And of course, no one on earth can give an answer to that. But some of you have lived long enough to know you have experienced hard times of suffering in the past. And you've lived long enough after them to know that God did some of the most remarkable things for you in those hard times that you never expected, you never dreamed would come from those times. And so that gives you, as you have that stage of wisdom, that gives you the possibility of facing even greater problems in the future, knowing that if God is faithful, he will be faithful in all my problems, not just some of them. And so suffering need not be approached simply from a rationalistic or skeptical point of view. It must be approached from the point of view. Let me add a word about skepticism. Skepticism is actually a worldview, but it's self-defeating. Skepticism says you must doubt everything. But if that's true, then you must doubt the affirmation that you must doubt everything. It's self-defeating, and you can't live a skeptical, completely skeptical life. It will lead you to despair and to hopelessness. And God didn't create us for that. Even in the midst of events, life periods where nothing seems to fit, nothing is right, our faith tells us all things work together for good. And if that's true, then even this must work together for good. I remember asking the question a night in 1967. I was sitting in my parents' sitting room and thinking, I know all things are supposed to work together for good, but I can't see how any good is going to come out of this. It was actually in the spring of 1968. Well, I've lived long enough to know that God brought real good out of that, though the event was virtually unbearable for me. So to be skeptical of everything only leads to despair. There is no other route to skepticism but despair. And Ecclesiastes is not teaching despair, as we shall see. One of the terms that we know that is fundamental to the book of Ecclesiastes is the word in the King James vanity. I have the NASV open here. It uses the word vanity there in verse 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Vanity in modern English, in modern American English, is a word that means self-centeredness, always focusing on yourself. A person who is vain. There's an old song that was popular when I was much younger. You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you. So a vain person is one who always looks to himself and judges everything by himself or by reference to his value system. This is not what vanity is. The other sense for a word, for the word vanity, it's kind of fallen out of use in modern English, modern American English, is a room. If someone has the mic on, if you could turn that off, thank you. A table in a room where a woman might be getting ready for the day, and she can sit down and there's a mirror there, and she can adjust her hair and whatever other adjustments need to be made. So that piece of furniture is called a vanity. Neither of these senses is relevant, of course, to the book of Hebrews. The Hebrew word, and I'm sorry I failed to get that Hebrew straightened out, but you don't care, it only bothers me. So that LBH over there on the right end of the line is supposed to be a Hebrew word. The word in Hebrew is hevel, Hebel, hevel. The word refers to what is unstable, transitory, useless, and here's our word vain again, empty, senseless, nonsense, bad. What is unstable, transitory. Transitory may be really at the core of what this word means. It's a hard word to translate because it has in different contexts, it will have a different kind of sense to its meaning. And so each of these, this is from Reiner Alberts in the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament. Again, once again, not that that matters to you, but you might be wondering what TLOT is. It's a relatively important word book on Old Testament. And so each of these, unstable, transitory, useless, empty, senseless, nonsense, bad. Each of these might be a sense for the word hevel in any particular usage in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's used in Ecclesiastes in three areas. One, human effort brings no profit. And we'll spend a little time in Ecclesiastes the next 2 weeks, possibly even today. But the big issue here is you can labor all your life long, and then you die, and you leave your labor to someone for whom it is of no consequence, that all the work you did is of no consequence. They just use it for their own purposes, often abuse it. In terms of wealth, there is a theory of a 3-generation development in wealth. The first generation builds the wealth. The second generation uses the wealth. And the third generation squanders the wealth. So and honestly, folks, let's take something from Indian culture. You have a man, very godly man, who is committed to the Lord, and he's set out to do ministry. And in the process, a group of people gather around him and they form a church, and he serves faithfully over the period of his life. He passes away, and it's not uncommon in India to pass the pastorate to the son of the father. The son labors on in the ministry, but when he passes to be with the Lord, the third generation may not understand what's going on, and the third generation simply looks at the church as a means to further his own interests. And so you really must be careful about the generational leadership in church. The mere descent from a godly father or grandfather is not a good indication of qualification for leadership. And this is what Solomon in Ecclesiastes is facing in 2:1, 11, 19, 21, 23, 44, and on many other occasions as you work through. So hevel, this transitory nature of things, the uselessness, the emptiness, the senselessness, human effort brings no profit. No matter how hard you work, your efforts will not leave any lasting effect. I thought years ago, it must be a wonderful thing to be an architect and build great bridges and great buildings. And in 2011, the illusion was burst for me. 2011 is the year 9/11. I'm sorry, not 2011. 2000. What year was that? 2001. 2011 of 2001. The Twin Towers in New York City were attacked by Muslim extremists flying jets into the Twin Towers, and they collapsed in a matter of minutes. And I thought, all the money that was spent on designing the buildings, all the money that was spent on building the buildings, all the money that was spent on maintaining the buildings, all the brilliance of the architect in preparing the plans for the building are gone in less than an hour. All of that is wasted in less than an hour by simply two men who had evil plans in their heart. So human effort brings no real profit. A second field in which Hevel is used is wisdom, mastery of life. If I gain genuine wisdom, even like the wisdom we talked about in Proverbs last time, the last 3 weeks, if I gain genuine godly wisdom, I embrace the fear of the Lord and I gain that wisdom, I die. And where is my wisdom now? Well, let's suppose that I write books and I enshrine that wisdom in the books. Who knows whether the people who survive me will even care about the books. I can remember when the president of our college here in Memphis died back in 1983. And all of us on the faculty were given the privilege of going into his office and taking any books that we wanted from them. And I took an old set of Bible dictionary, Bible encyclopedia, and it sat on my shelf for this was 1983, so it sat on my shelf until 2020. I never referred to it, not once, but it was Dr. Crichton's set. And I thought, well, that I'd like to have, but it was an old dictionary, an old encyclopedia, probably printed in the early part of the 20th century. So much research has been done since that time. I never felt the need to consult that dictionary. And so 2 years ago, in the end of 2020, when we moved to Memphis, I just gave it away, gave it to the library at the seminary. I don't know whether they sold it or kept it or what, but where is the wisdom? Even the wisdom that was in those encyclopedia volumes, where is it now? Does anybody care? And any wisdom that I may accrue, I may try to pass on to my son or my daughter. I may not be able to do it. So what is the value? What is the permanent, note the word transitory at the top of the screen, what is the permanent value of wisdom in that regard? I die. It has benefited me during my life, but has it benefited anybody else? The third area in which Hevel is used is in human transience. And this is what we've just been facing. Death confronts us. We don't think of it that way, but death hangs over us every day of our lives. Every time I go out the door, death hangs over me. I was confronted with this forcefully at the funeral of the man that I call my favorite professor several years ago. He was a great teacher, an amazing teacher, and a kind of a Renaissance man. There was hardly anything that he hadn't read or thought about or even taught. But here he was dead. We were at his funeral. And as I sat there, I looked around the room, and it was packed out. It was standing room only. All the seats were taken, and people were standing around the walls and in the foyer of the church building. And I thought, a number of these folks are his former students. He helped found 3 churches in Dallas. But a lot of the people who were attending the service were his former students. And I thought to myself, all of us wanted from him a book on John, a book on Hebrews, a book on Romans, and a book on Revelation. He was working on a book of systematic theology when he died. And we wanted also, especially I wanted a book from him on the use of the Old Testament and the New Testament. We got one small, thin volume on the use of the Old Testament and the New, which was a distillation of a series of lectures he gave at a college in the North, someplace in America in the North. That's it. Nothing else. We got no other books from him. And I thought, all of that learning is gone. And what's the use? And here I am. When he passed away, I was living in Dallas. I was on the faculty at the seminary in those days. And I thought, what's the use of all this learning? What's the use? And I thought, well, the use is what he poured into the life of those whom he served, us, his students. He never knew me. I met him once, and he would never have recognized me in a crowd anywhere. But he taught me, and he taught me in ways that were outside the sphere of the seminary, for he had a vast library of recorded teaching. And I had maybe 100 cassette tapes from him, but they've all worn out now and they've been thrown away. So what's the use? And the best I can do is to say, well, he passed on some of what he learned to us, his students. And he did affect our lives. But death confronts us and makes so much of what we do meaningless. The things that I spend my life trying to do. We have a very pleasant house to live in. It's not large by American standards. It's very comfortable. And even in the neighborhood in which I live, it's one of the smallest houses. But I've amassed enough money to be able to pay for most of the house. I have a small loan on it, which I think I'll be able to pay off in the next year or so. But I will pass away. My wife will pass away. We'll leave it to our children. And oy vey. Sorry, folks. I'll get it back here. So now we'll leave it to our children. They will likely sell the house and divide whatever proceeds come from the sale of the house among themselves, and that will help them in some measure. But all the books that I have, nobody cares about the books that I have. Nobody cares about my musical instrument that I love and loved in my schooling days. Nobody cares about the piano that my wife loves. Nobody cares, and nobody will want it. No one cares that Jim Allman or Jan Allman had used those and loved them in the past. I have a framed set of 3 hammers on the wall here in my study. One hammer belonged to my grandfather Allman. He was a carpenter and built houses. The second hammer belonged to my uncle Ralph, who was a craftsman. His profession was in business, but he was a craftsman, and it was his hammer. And the third is an upholstery hammer that belonged to my grandfather Doyle, and I value them. I'm so glad to have them. My mother had them framed for me, and they're on the wall of my study as I speak, and I'm looking at them. But my children won't care about Granddad Allman and Uncle Ralph and Granddad Doyle. They never met the two grandfathers. They did meet Uncle Ralph, but they never met the two grandfathers. What's the point of all of this collection? Human transience confronts us with the transitory nature and the useless nature of so much that we think is important in daily life. There are some antonyms. When you're trying to understand a biblical word, one way of understanding it, making some advance in actually understanding a word, is to look for not only synonyms, but antonyms. Just in case there are some of you for whom this is a new word, an antonym is a word that is the opposite of some other word. So the opposite of hot would be cold. The opposite of high would be low, and so forth. So we're talking about antonyms for hevel. So what kinds of things does Solomon talk about that would be the opposite of hevel, transitory, useless? One is yithron, which means prophet. Yithron, the Hebrew word yithron here, is a word that refers to what goes beyond what is necessary, what is essential, what is basic. So a related word, it talks about in Leviticus, talks about an appendage to the liver. Now I'm on the verge of talking about things that I know nothing about, because we're talking about anatomy and I've never studied any anatomy. And Thompson Bisoy is sitting there with perhaps with his wife next to him who teaches anatomy. And so I will probably go false on this, but perhaps you will tolerate. In slaughtering an animal for sacrifice, there are occasions when you take parts of the animal and burn it on the altar. So the parts of the animal, you take the fat that covers the kidneys and the fat that's associated with the kidneys. You take the appendage of the liver, and that's this. It's not the exact word yithron, but it's directly related. It comes from the same root. And so prophet is the Hebrew word here, prophet. Hevel means that there's no lasting profit in life. Second, chalik, 2:20 and 21. Chalik is a word that's used for the allotments of the land to the tribes in Canaan. So portion, legacy. Is there any legacy in what we do? Is there any legacy in wisdom? Is there any legacy in hard work? Is there any legacy in pleasure? What can I leave to someone else? So chalik. Tov is a word that means good, can mean pleasure, has a lot of different senses in the Old Testament. One of which is interesting. When you make a treaty between warring nations, then you restore tov, goodness, to the two nations. And I think in that kind of context, it would mean something like friendly relationships, but good or pleasure. Is there any profit in pleasure? One of the things you notice in life, I guess you've noticed it, I have, is the happy times pass quickly. Sad times stay and stay and stay. In part, it's because of our experience. Happy times, we enjoy, and yet they pass so quickly. I can remember thinking when I was going to be hooded for my doctorate, I'm going to pay attention to every moment of walking across the platform, stopping, shaking hands with the president of the seminary, as it turned out, kneeling down so that or at least bending my knees so that the chairman of the PhD studies committee could put the hood over my head and around my neck. And as they gave me the diploma and I walked, I was going to enjoy every minute of it. And when it was over, it passed so quickly. It just passed so quickly. But when you're sick, when you're in pain, when sorrow has come, those long nights last forever. Is there anything that transcends pleasure? Yes. Pain, anxiety transcend pleasure. They replace it quickly and it's gone. What are the reasons for the book Skepticism? Kohelet was demonstrating that life without God has no meaning. And we're beginning now to get to the real core of what Ecclesiastes is about. It wants to demonstrate that without God, life has no meaning. And that's crucial for us. All of you have embraced this. You wouldn't be involved in this kind of study if you had not embraced some aspect of this kind of thinking. Solomon was affirming that since much in life cannot be fully understood, we must live by faith and not by sight. There's an awful percentage of life that is simply going through the motions, and I don't know what the value of it is. I don't see any particular use for it. 1969, it became evident that I was going to be called up for service in the United States Army when I graduated from college. This was not my plan. This was not what the Lord was supposed to do. The Lord was supposed to let my wife and me get married in 1970 and start a home and start teaching. She was going to be teaching in the Oklahoma City public schools, and I had a teaching job at a really fine school where they were going to help me get my master's degree. We were going to get an apartment in Oklahoma City, and we were going to settle down and start a family, and life was going to be good. But suddenly, during 1969, during the height of the Vietnam War, it was now suddenly God's plan to put me into the United States Army. I reported 9 days after we got married. I reported for training and was sent to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for my basic training. And I thought, Lord, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? It took years to see any value in that time, but I have seen it. The Lord prepared in those 3 years where I was so confused. What is the Lord doing? He prepared me for ministry. He prepared me to pay for my master's degree at Dallas Seminary. My service in the United States Army paid for my 4 years of my master's degree and the first year of my doctoral degree. Now, tell me that the Lord has no purpose in hardship. You can't tell me that because I've experienced it too many times. So Solomon was affirming that since much in life cannot fully be understood, we must live by faith and not by sight. I have learned this, I think. When trouble comes in the future, I will know whether I have learned it or not. But at present, I have learned this, I think, over the years. And I trust that in future difficulties, when hardships come, I will approach it with this point of view. But continuing, Ecclesiastes and its realistic view of life counterbalances the unqualified optimism of traditional wisdom. And here the word traditional is being used in a sense. Oy vey, where did that go? There it is. In a sense where we're talking about not specifically Proverbs, but the wisdom of the ancient Near East. And there is a wide tradition of wisdom in the ancient Near East. Even portions of the book of Ecclesiastes, of Proverbs, not many, not very long, but 4, 5, 6 verses are taken right out of a wisdom book written in Egyptian for the Egyptian pharaohs. But it counterbalances the unqualified optimism of traditional wisdom. And here I have a source cited, Roy B. Zook, an article that he wrote, an essay called A Theology of the Wisdom Books and the Song of Solomon. Dr. Zook didn't write much that was in book form. He was more of a collector. This particular book is a theology of the Old Testament, and he was the editor of the book and then wrote the chapter on theology of the wisdom books and the Song of Solomon. I would commend that book to you, and anything that you can find by Zook. He has collected some of the best essays on any area that he wrote on, and he wrote an excellent book on the book of Job that we'll mention in future studies. So what do we mean by the unqualified optimism of traditional wisdom? Compare Proverbs 13:4. The desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. Is that true? If you work hard, you're diligent at your work, are you always satisfied? And it depends on what you mean by satisfied and with what. If you're a craftsman, the answer is probably no. One of our granddaughters, the oldest of our granddaughters, is quite an artist, and she does some beautiful things. She did. There's a famous architectural device in the city of Memphis. It's called the Hernando de Soto Bridge. The Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto came up through the area where Memphis is now and crossed and passed Memphis, and then crossed the Mississippi River and went on further north and west. But they've named the bridge the Memphis Bridge, or the Hernando de Soto Bridge. It is beautiful. It's graceful, 2 graceful arches, and they're just so beautiful to watch. Hannah, our granddaughter, did a line drawing of the Hernando de Soto Bridge. My wife loves it, and I do too. It's very, very well done. Hannah hates it. She hides it. She can't be satisfied with her own work because she's a perfectionist. She works diligently. She really works diligently at her art, but she is never satisfied with it. Is it the case that the desires of the diligent are always satisfied, fully satisfied? The answer is no, they're not. Compare that with Ecclesiastes 2:22 and 23. For what does a man get in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days, his task is painful and grievous. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. I can remember in the doctoral program, I would go to bed and my mind would start racing, and I couldn't get loose from the thoughts. And I found if I took a recording tape by my favorite professor and put it on next to the bed where I could hear it, I could focus on what he was talking about. My mind wouldn't be chasing all these other thoughts, and I could go to sleep. My favorite professor put me to sleep more nights than he would ever want to know. But then I'd wake up in the middle of the night and my mind would be racing again. All his days, his task is painful and grievous. Even at night, his mind does not rest. Is it the case that the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied? And the answer is yes, but you got to understand what the desires of the diligent are. Often the diligent take pleasure in the very work itself. And in that pleasure, there is satisfaction, but in the result, there may not be satisfaction. Proverbs 8:11, for wisdom is better than jewels, and all desirable things cannot compare with her. And because we know a broader context for thinking about Proverbs 8:11, we can say this really is true. And when I think about wisdom, as we did some weeks ago, and understand what wisdom really is, this really is true. Except when I have to pay my bills each month. Then I can't take the checkbook of wisdom out and pay it out of that checkbook. I have to pay it out of a bank account that has actual money in it, and so jewels and so on, so that I can pay the bills. So is it really true that wisdom is better than jewels? When I compare that with Ecclesiastes 2:15, then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also be, and notice this is chapter 2. So we're still heavily into the passage where the book seems to be written by Solomon, and I think it is written by Solomon. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been so extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is Hevel. Are there contradictions? Zook is going to give an answer, no. As stated in the section on Proverbs, that book usually looks at the opposites in life without noting exceptions. And note the word usually there, that's important. Doesn't always omit the exceptions, but its big point is to lay out the value of wisdom and the wastefulness of folly. Ecclesiastes is tempering this. So Ecclesiastes, however, points out that while a righteous order does exist as affirmed in Proverbs, and this is part of what Ecclesiastes is teaching, there is a righteous order that Proverbs affirms. It is not always evident to man as he views life under the sun from his finite perspective. So as I look from the surface of the world out, as Ecclesiastes does, if I just look at life as I see it, as it confronts me day by day, I don't see the order there. So I have to start with a faith position. I have to start with the assumption that both Ecclesiastes and Proverbs teach that a righteous order does exist. I just may not be able to discern it at the moment in any possible circumstance of life. Job and Ecclesiastes, both wisdom books, demonstrate exceptions to what Proverbs often states in black and white fashion. The books then are complementary, not contradictory, even though the affirmations in Proverbs are normally true, and that's crucial. What Proverbs is teaching is what is true normally, but there are exceptions to it. Exceptions, as observed in Job and Ecclesiastes, do exist. And once again, quotation from Zook. Proverbs affirms by faith, not by sight, as is commonly assumed, that a righteous order exists in the world. But Kohelet contends that righteous order cannot be discerned by sight. So I must start with faith if I'm going to gain wisdom. I have to believe the word of God. I have to trust him, that he is creator, that he has built this world in a certain way, that if I live in accord with the way he has built the world, I will be more successful. That success does not necessarily translate into wealth. Under the Mosaic covenant, it would, but not in the new covenant. In the new covenant, it results in suffering because suffering is the only route to the kingdom. It's the way the king took to the kingdom. Why should it be different? Why should the route to the kingdom be different for you and me? Why should the route to the kingdom be pleasure and satisfaction and happiness and comfort and wealth when the king took the way of the cross. Why did the king tell his disciples, if anyone comes after me and does not take up his own cross, he's not worthy to be my disciple? So we have to learn from Proverbs by faith that a righteous order exists in the world. But Kohelet contends that righteous order cannot be discerned by sight. This latter premise, that even the wise cannot explain the apparent lack of order in the world, is simply Kohelet's way of expounding the limitations of wisdom. This is from Neil Williams, a class. He and I graduated together with our masters and our doctorates, but his dissertation that he wrote in 1984, same year that I wrote my dissertation, is the source of this material. Compare Proverbs 26:12. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. So I've got to become a man who is not wise in my own eyes. I must be wise in God's eyes. And when I am wise in God's eyes, when I am wise with the wisdom of God, then there will be hope for me. But the hope is not before death. The hope is the resurrection. The hope is the coming kingdom. The hope is the return of Christ. The hope is the time in 1 Corinthians 15 when the Son turns the kingdom over to the Father, that God may be all and in all. That's where my hope lies. My hope does not lie in this world. My hope is beyond this life. Another reason for skepticism, Ecclesiastes, are we ever going to get through all this? Yes, we will. Ecclesiastes affirms that the only answer to the meaning and lasting value of life is to fear God and enjoy one's lot in life. I have often said to students when I'm teaching Ecclesiastes, if you don't enjoy what God has given, why should you expect him to give you something better? So if you don't like the lot you're in, this is from God. Why would you not expect that God would use it meaningfully in your life? And if he's going to use it meaningfully in your life, perhaps you should get as deeply involved in your lot now, experiencing what God intends you to experience, and figuring out that life does not find its culmination prior to death. It finds its culmination in the kingdom. And if that's the case, then live for the kingdom. In India one year, I was reading a book called Kingship and the Psalms by a man named John Eaton. And he convinced me. I read through the book, I surveyed it again, then I read Psalms in Hebrew from cover to cover, so Psalms 1 to 150, trying to see if Eaton's hypothesis was right. His hypothesis is that the book of Psalms is essentially a royal hymn book. That he says that the terminology he uses is the book of Psalms is virtually all about and virtually means there are some exceptions, but virtually every psalm in the book of Psalms is either about the Davidic kingship or about the divine kingship as expressed through the Davidic kingship. And he convinced me, not only from his argument, but also from reading through the book of Psalms. But that created a problem for me, and it first solved a problem. How can the book of Psalms be simply applied to Jesus? Because if it's a Davidic hymn book, then it's applicable to Jesus. If it's a hymn book about the kingdom of God, it's applicable to Jesus. But then how is it applicable to me? And that was the second problem that I confronted. and set out to solve. And this morning, before we met, I was synthesizing some things, and I wrote down the answer. I got the answer finally. It started yesterday, and I got the final answer this morning. If I am identified with the Messiah, and if I am engaged in the Messiah's agenda, will you allow me just a moment to go get my notes so that I can read it as I wrote it, because it's better than I now remember it. I'll be right back. Okay, here it is. When I belong to Messiah and I'm involved in Messiah's agenda, I may expect Messiah's promises to be mine.
Sir, wait till we write it, sir.
Yes. When I belong to Messiah and I'm involved in Messiah's agenda, I may expect Messiah's promises to be mine. And there are two aspects to the Messiah's agenda. One is the known agenda, rule, yes, 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 but also redeeming the world. And how does he redeem the world? Is it not through his suffering? Is it? Is that right? He redeems the world through his suffering. All right. Then I've got to be involved in the Messiah's agenda. And there are two aspects of it. One is the known agenda. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is the known agenda. Then second, there is the secret agenda or the unknown agenda. Those events that overtake us in the providence of God that he places us into apart from our choice. So going into the United States Army was the unknown agenda that God had for my life. And I couldn't see how there was anything involving any work of God by sending me to the Army during the Vietnam War. That was incomprehensible to me. And yet it turned out to be the very plan of God to prepare me for seminary and prepare me for a life of ministry. Astonishing how that worked. So here, Zook says, Ecclesiastes affirms that the only answer to the meaning and lasting value of life is to fear God and enjoy one's lot in life. How much better would it have been for me to be a very serious soldier, serious about the training, instead of doing the bare minimum to get through? How much better, how much more discipline would I have in my life if I had approached my training in the United States military that way? So here is kind of the summation of it, of the whole book. Ecclesiastes affirms that the only answer to, and this is why it's not a pessimistic book at all, but we tend, I've been listening to some folks talking about these things. Why do we focus more on bad things than on pleasant things in our lives? The answer is we are created to avoid danger. God created us to avoid danger. But by embracing sin in the garden, we embraced danger. And so all of our life now is under the pall under the shroud of danger. And so we pay much more attention to danger than we do to anything else. And so in our life, when something is dangerous, we focus on that and it brings us misery. Whereas if we were to look at life the way God has made it, we would find that the only answer to the meaning and lasting value of life is to fear God, not circumstances, and to enjoy one's lot in life. Yes, but you don't know what my lot in life is. I don't need to. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Bible affirms that what the unknown agenda of God in your life, the things that you got into without being specifically part of your plan and desire, are still the plan of God for your life. And he is producing in you, through suffering, through hardship, the likeness of Christ. Finally, here in our introduction, here is an outline of the book. There's a monologue in chapters 1:12 to 12:8. The first part of it, 1:12 to 6:9, seeking from experience and reflection for what might be good for people to do under heaven. And then the second part, wisdom instruction on life's true values, growing out of Solomon's experience and reflection, 6:10 to 11:6. And finally, C, what is good is to pursue God, enjoy life in the days of your youth, since old age and death will come soon. And then there is an epilogue to the book. So next week, when we get together again, we will get into the prologue and begin working our way, picking out. I can't do the whole book of Proverbs in 3 hours or 2 hours and a half. So the best I can do is give you some highlights from the book, but this is what we'll do next week. Okay, we'll open it up for questions. Any of you have questions that we can answer?
Sir,
మరి నాకు తెలియదు కదా లేకపోతే నేను వెళ్ళిపోదు.
oh, sir, this is Shyam.
Yes.
Sir, regarding the authorship, are you agree with Solomon's authorship?
Regarding the authorship?
Yeah, I think he's saying whether do you agree that it is Solomon who wrote the book?
I think it almost has to be. If it's not, the claim is fictitious, and that's troubling to me, number one. Number two, if it's not, then you can tell me anything that you've not experienced, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but if you've experienced it. I had a roommate in college who, as a single man, owned 2 cars, and they were cars that were very popular back in the early mid 60s. They were nice cars, and he was good looking and athletic and intelligent. He had everything going for him. And one of my high school classmates was in the same dorm with us. And he said to Ron, he said, "Man, you've got 2 beautiful cars. Those are fantastic cars." And Ron, my roommate, said, "Oh, wheels are wheels." And wheels was a way of referring to a car in the 1960s. What he's saying is, one car gets you from here to there. Another car will get you from here to the same destination. So what's the difference? When you had 2 cars, and they were very nice cars, it was easy to say. But that he had 2 cars that were very nice cars, and I had none whatsoever, indicated, well, one car is as good as another. There are cars that you enjoy looking at more than another. There are cars that you enjoy driving better than another, but one car is as good as another for transportation. If I had said that, it wouldn't make any sense. But if Ron said that, it made a lot of sense. And if Solomon is not the author of the book, if it's just some wise man centuries later who's writing this book, then I don't know whether it's true or not. But if Solomon says it, then it makes perfect sense. So I think Solomon is the author, though there are reasons to raise questions about that, and people have raised questions about it for centuries. Other questions?
Dr. Allman, there is this question concerning the book being more philosophical in nature and less of theology in a way. But yeah, as we read, I think it you have already given enough for us to think about it. But I'm just wondering, how would you? Is it okay to bridge with the worldly philosophy and theology from this book, or?
This is not worldly philosophy, it's divine philosophy. And it's telling us what the world is really like and how we, as people of God, really relate to it. This is not the place where we're going to find ultimate meaning. That's what Ecclesiastes is telling us. It is theological at its heart. It's just it's kind of a theology that we're not accustomed to. We're accustomed to theological prolegomena, bibliology, theology proper, and those various spheres. But those are the questions we have asked the Bible. We have not allowed the Bible to tell us the questions we should be asking and getting its answers. And here's what Ecclesiastes is doing.
Wow, very well said. I think now it appears like we are reading more into the book from our understanding of the worldly philosophies.
That's right.
They're trying to draw parallels to it rather than taking the book as it is. Wow, thank you for that insight.
Since you bring that up, one thing that I need to add to the introduction is when you want to know what a literary piece is about, look for what gets repeated. And there are things that are repeated. And you know, one of them is vanity is repeated over and over again in the book. But the other is, in all this, I realized that there is nothing better for a man than to enjoy life, to enjoy the wife of his youth. For this is a gift from God. So there is a negative side, the uselessness of life. So what is useful? Well, pursuing the wisdom of God. And secondly, enjoying the lot that God has given. So if I don't enjoy the food that God has given me, why should I expect him to give me better food? If I don't enjoy the wife God has given me, why should I expect him to give me a better wife? So I've got to learn to enjoy the gifts that God has given rather than the gifts that I want.
Wow, outstanding. Thank you. Wow. Friends, do you have any other questions that you want to ask Dr. Allman? We are almost there, but yeah. If you have any questions, we'll take it. Otherwise, we'll call it a day.
Sir, one more thing. So, how can we connect the worldly wisdom Paul says in Colossians 2:8? So, how can we understand this Ecclesiastic Solomon?
Yeah.
Could you explain, please?
Good question. What Solomon is doing is taking the worldly wisdom and showing us how empty it is and replacing it with divine wisdom. Enjoy life. So at the end, if you look at the end of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, there are two things in chapter 12 every Dallas seminary understands. One is, of the making of many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the soul. Is that true, Brother Tim? Is that's the lot in life of the Dallas seminaries?
A lot to read.
But the other is in verses 12, 13, and 14. Verse 13 and 14. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments. Because this applies to every person, for God will bring every act into judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. This is how the book ends. This is not worldly wisdom. It's attacking worldly wisdom. It's attacking the pessimism of the world. So this is not worldly wisdom at all. It is saying, yeah, if you look at the world from a worldly point of view, that's the way you're going to see it. But there's a better way to look at it. You must not find all your meaning in work. You must not find all your meaning in achievement. You must not look for all your meaning in learning. You must find it in God. So.
Yes.
Excellent, sir. It's very useful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Dear friends, I sincerely mean when I say, please do share this material with some of your friends. Yeah, I I haven't seen a better teacher on these things for sure as of now for Telugu people, who is available for Telugu people. So please do share these videos with people whom you love, and especially those who are in teaching ministry and preaching ministry, so that they may be blessed. I'm surprised how what a small group we have. Of course, though I really believe that smaller groups are good, but I'm surprised that when we look at the number of people listening to these lectures is very small. So I encourage the group members to at least share this with others, maybe at least invite one good brother or sister who can benefit out of this. Yeah, maybe this is the first time I'm sharing such a thing, but please do share it with your friends. And maybe if you can take a vouch to bring at least one person from your side, that would be a blessing to them for sure. So yeah, thank you very much for joining this evening. And Dr. Allman, once again, thank you for your ministry, the passion and the clarity that you bring by God's grace. And we really appreciate that, and we praise God for you. We continue to pray for you. And yeah. And good night to all the friends in India, and have a great day, Doctor.
Good night.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, sir.